Hey guys, welcome back to Historic Auto Attractions in Roscoe, Illinois. Now, if you guys haven't seen any of my earlier videos, this is probably hands down the best museum of historical artifacts and automobiles outside of the Smithsonian. I can't stress enough how great this place is. Now, today we are going to check out the Abraham Lincoln exhibit, and we're going to talk with the museum historian, Tony, who's going to point out a couple of things and tell us a little bit about the artifacts. Now, if you're ever in the Midwest and you can check out this place on your own in person, please do. Be sure to ask for Tony, and he'll tell you everything you could ever want to know about any artifact in this museum. Now, let's go take a look.
Good morning. My name's Tony, and I certainly want to do my best to explain some of the artifacts in here. And if anybody has any questions, you can certainly call me at any time. And what I tried to do is just highlight items so it's nice and short and interesting. This year we have this famous cord. This was in the president's office in Springfield. And of course, what's ironic is every day that he would adjust his blinds, and of course he actually touched his cord every day that he was in there working. So I thought that that was really kind of unique because it's an artifact that's one of the only, of course, left. Next we have the carpet here that the president stood on. Now, why this is so ironic is because in August 5th, 1959, there was the Indian Hill fire that destroyed many artifacts, and that was Ben Purley Porter was the collector in West Newbury, Massachusetts, and a lot of the President Lincoln artifacts were destroyed. However, this one remains, and I've been told by the famous historians that have worked really extensively that this is so incredibly famous because it's virtually so important because the president stood on it and so many others were lost. Next we have the 6 handles that were on the president's casket. When they put the president into a new casket, what they did is, of course, they destroyed the original casket, but handles being made of metal, they ended up, of course, was part of the collection of Herbert Wells Fay, and he was a longtime caretaker of the Lincoln tomb and exhibit, and so, of course, he kept them in them. And eventually what happens is normally family members just decide to sell the artifact, and a lot of them, of course, want them to go to museums, and we thank them for that. And of course, the next 2 items, there was a lot of research that I had to do on the coin over the president's eye and also the handkerchief. And when Dr. Robert Stone, that was the president's personal physician, and Dr. Charles Sabin Taft, of course, when they went out, they had to explain to Mrs. Lincoln that her husband had passed. And what they did is they had asked the person there, Munson Bradhurst Field, which was the assistant to the director of the Treasury of the United States, and asked him if he had, some change that looked new, and of course he did. And he also supplied the handkerchief, and here you have the coin, and here you have the handkerchief. Now, of course, Munson Bradhurst Field, what he did is he kept everything until 1868, and then he gave it to Judge Julius Rockwell, and it stayed in the Rockwell family through generations, and passed down first with Francis Rockwell all the way down, and then eventually it came up, and of course Dr. Latimer was the one that ended up purchasing this. And of course next you have Mrs. Lincoln's mourning skirt on the tragic day, and of course she also wore for her son Willie, and again after her husband was assassinated, so that's why this is incredibly famous. She did give it to one of her closest friends, Mrs. James H. Notlin of Chicago. Her husband was a very famous attorney in Chicago. And we do have some other artifacts in here that I'll show you that went ahead and also went to Mrs. Notlin. Here we have all the conspiracy people that were involved, the actual bandages that tied the hand on Mary Surratt's hands, and of course we have the manacles here that were worn by Lewis Payne. He also went by the name of Lewis Powell. He used both names. He was a very, very violent individual, and they kept these on him almost all the time because when they took him off, he immediately would fight. When he was executed, he did have these on, so these are part of this. And then, of course, the conspirators, the gun case on. That was the hub that carried all of the decedents away. And people say, well, why do they call it a caisson? Well, caisson means French for chest, because they used to use it when they had cannons and they would keep, and that was how the name caisson came about. It means chest. And scaffolding, people ask that a lot. Well, what's a scaffolding? Well, that's Italian. Scaffolding means Italian, and of course what that was the raised platform of which the president's casket was on. And here's the largest remaining piece to anybody that is privately owned, and that was underneath President Lincoln's casket. And of course, Captain Alexander Wallace Austin, that was part of the honor guard, asked Mrs. Lincoln if he could please have part of that cloth because he was so close to the Lincolns. And here you have the cloth, and then she also gave him the 2 tassels. So that's all together, and it remained in the Austin family for generations until Dr. Latimer ended up getting it. Now this here is the president's all-time favorite chair, and this was in his study. However, the independent sign company that we used at the time, they assumed that there was an Oval Office in 1865, but that did not develop until 1909. So this is very difficult once we seal it. Very difficult to get into. It takes a long time to do all the screws. There's just tons of screws and all safety items. However, the chair is accurate. And here's what was unique that I found out working with the White House Historical Association. This was a chair actually that the president was sitting in when Mrs. Lincoln came and told him, well, it's time, dear, to leave to go to the Ford Theater. So he had been reading all of his paperwork from the cabinet assignments that day that they passed to him, and so he simply put everything on the table next to him, got up out of this chair, and then the rest is the tragic history. So that's why this chair is his all-time favorite chair. Very, very comfortable. I'm going to kind of step over here because I think this is kind of unique. Here's the president's personal razor. And also his personal spoon. Now the president, of course, he came from a poor family, never threw anything away. And people want to know, well, what happened to the spoon? And I investigated. It took me a long time to come up with what the experts were able to tell me on this. But when he was riding a horse early in his career, that he reached in to pull a map out of the saddlebag, and the spoon accidentally fell out, and the horse behind it stepped on it. So I had an equestrian, a horse expert, come in and try to match up, and he said, yeah, that could very well be simply because of the step on how it would hit. So I thought that was kind of unique, but since it would cut his mouth, he couldn't use it any longer, but he did keep it because it did have value. So this is, of course, Mrs. Lincoln's hat, veil, and fan, and she was so traumatized there again after the tragic event of the funeral. Shortly thereafter, she did give all of this to Mrs. James H. Nolan, the close friend of Mrs. Lincoln, and as I mentioned earlier, also a very successful attorney in Chicago. This here is the famous flag that was commissioned on July 5th, 1863 for the president. And this is the was the bodyguard and also was the carrier, and he belonged to the basically the old guard. And his master, Sergeant Smith Stimmel, he was so incredibly loyal and tough. When I worked with the old guard, they were giving me the history on him. And they said if he would have been there that night at the Ford Theater, that John Wilkes Booth wouldn't even been able to get close to the president. However, the president told him, "I want you to take the night off. Mrs. Lincoln and I just want to go on our own. We're going to have two friends come with us, but we're just going to be on our own and we'll be okay." And of course, the tragic history is the assassination. But this here was decommissioned in 1865. And this was the flag that I've been told by the Washington historians, the ones that are really, and also Springfield that I talked to. This is the flag actually that was behind the president when he gave the Gettysburg Address, which is really famous. And it was decommissioned on July 5th, 1865, and that was the first day that the actual Secret Service began for the U.S. Treasury. However, they were not assigned to protect the president. That did not happen full-time until President Theodore Roosevelt. So it took that long because of, assassinations and everything. But what they did is they worked with Treasury fraud and things like that back in the but that was the beginning of. And I worked very closely with the United States Secret Service on a lot of our exhibits. And so they gave me the whole background, which was quite fascinating. So if you want a little bit more information on that, please let me know. And that kind of pretty well covers the items in here that just kind of jump out. And of course, these others are just... Now, this is not the actual coach that the president rode in that night. Okay. That coach is in the Studebaker Museum in Indiana. However, this particular coach was made exactly the same time by the Wood brothers in 1864. And what they did is they made separate coaches, presidential coaches and other coaches. And so when Wayne found out that they were restoring one of the coaches that was back to the time period of Abraham Lincoln, President Lincoln, then he decided, well, let's go ahead and get that because it's that time period, and you can see it's beautifully restored. It was built by the Wood brothers in 1864, so it did transport the President Lincoln and his wife, but it in other events, not the night of the actual assassination.
Now, I hope you guys enjoyed this video of Abraham Lincoln relics. I'll show you a couple more better shots of the relics themselves. But once again, this is Historic Auto Attractions Museum in Roscoe, Illinois. And I'm going to be doing a lot of different videos with them this year. And there's going to be a lot of other cool stuff coming up on this channel. But be sure that if you are up in the Northern Illinois area, that you come in and check this place out. I will put a link in the description of this video. And aside from that, thanks so much for watching, guys, and we'll catch you on the next video.